Hello, and welcome to the Brighter Thinking Pod from Cambridge University Press. My name is Adam, and I'm one of the producers on the pod. Before we get started with today's topic, I want you to imagine the time you'd save if you had classroom assessments that mark themselves. Assessments that adapt to every student's abilities and aptitudes. I'm talking about testing that's suitable for all ages with the power to reveal individual strengths and struggles. This technology frees you to teach, gives you more insight than ever before, and allows you to set motivational goals for each of your students. Sound good? Okay, stop imagining. What I've just described are baseline assessments from the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring. If you're interested in learning more, go to cem.org. That's cem.org. Okay, let's get on with the pod.
Hello, and welcome to this special episode of the Brighter Thinking Pod from Cambridge University Press. I'm your host, Paul Ellis, Head of Teaching and Learning at Cambridge Assessment International Education. In this special episode, we are going to talk about the objectives of education and how best to prepare our students for the future. Our focus is a new book we have recently published called Thrive: The Purpose of Schools in a Changing World. Let me introduce our guests to you today, who are the co-authors of Thrive. They are Valerie Hannon, co-founder of the Innovation Unit and the Global Education Leaders Partnership and consultant advisor to the OECD and various education ministries, and Dr. Amelia Peterson, part of the founding faculty of the London Interdisciplinary School and holder of a PhD in education from Harvard University. Welcome to you both. You will also hear later on from 4 school leaders based in the UK and Canada who feature in the book. Andy Moor, CEO of Holy Family Catholic Multi-Academy Trust, based in the Wirral in northwest England. Brooke Moore, District Principal of Inquiry and Innovation at Delta School District in British Columbia. Kim Ondrik, Head Learner or Principal of Mill Bay Nature School on Vancouver Island. And Rae Snape, Head Teacher of Milton Road Primary School in Cambridge, England. If you'd like more details about any of the links and information we discuss, please take a look at the podcast show notes. You can also get in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag BrighterPod, or one word, BrighterPod, or by tweeting us at CUP Education, or one word, CUP Education. Before we talk about Valerie's and Amelia's book, we thought it would be useful to get to know a bit more about them. So to start with, I'll take each of you in turn. We'll see who speaks first. Please can each of you start by telling us a little bit about your own education and how it has helped you to thrive in your lives and careers so far.
Well, I'm going to cede to Amelia because I suspect that she's going to say rather more positive things about her education than I have to say about mine. So Amelia, why don't you kick off?
Yeah, sure. No, I do have lots of positive things to say about my education, although I think that some of the less positive aspects were part of what got me interested in this area in the first place. I think in many ways I had fantastic teachers who were very, very thoughtful, very caring. I was incredibly fortunate to be in a very sort of privileged environment as I was being educated right the way through school and higher education. But often there was a feeling that we were a bit restricted in what we could do by the expectations around the curriculum and by the expectations of what we were there for. I think there was an idea, a very strong sort of guiding idea that what we were there for was to pass exams as well as possible. And, possibly beyond that, to kind of become successful in some sort of vague, abstract way. There's a lot of emphasis on sort of what it would mean to be successful. And I think those things, while, important, and I do think exams can have their place in some ways, they're obviously not the be all and end all of education. They're not everything that education is about. And so my interest in them were kind of how did we end up in this situation with a feeling that our curriculum was sort of so driven by the requirements of assessment design, and that many educators themselves felt like they were kind of restricted in in what other interests, what other things that they cared about, what other things that students cared about could be brought into schools and the classroom. That really sort of started off my road working in education.
Thank you, Valerie. Then you've had time to think.
I didn't need to think about it very long. I have in the past thought a great deal about my education. And I'm of an older generation than Amelia. I'm straightforwardly of the age to be her mother. And my education was in school entirely in Catholic convents. And there's a dual edge to that. On one side, I had huge admiration for these women who had dedicated their lives to something other than the sort of conventional kind of make job, career, family children, but who saw a kind of a higher calling. And there was something very inspirational about that. At the same time, it was incredibly narrow and uninformed about the real world. In short, they didn't have a clue about how the world worked. And as a result, neither did I. So it was a very narrow education, I feel, a very unbalanced education. I took 3 languages and no sciences. So I knew no science, I mean 0, which is remarkable now. But the worst of it, I think, came from, I am of the generation when higher education was just expanding. I'm a working class kid. I came from a home where there were literally no books in the house, literally. And the message I received from my family was the only way out of this is education. Get yourself an education, get your exams, get out of here. And I learned that lesson well. So the focus, as Amelia said, nothing had changed really in those 30 years or so, was getting your exams, period. But then thereafter, I didn't have a clue what to do with myself because I had no experience of thinking beyond those academic confines. And indeed, in terms of my choice of both university and degree course, it was just, what am I good at in school? I'll carry on doing that. And then, by the way, what am I going to do with myself after university? Well, all I know is education, so I might as well do that. I mean, many people say, did you have a great vocation? Why did you choose to be an educator? Answer, lack of imagination. And that's the truth of it. So I'm pretty critical of the whole sorry business, really. As someone remarked to me, if I had a good chance in life, I could have done something with my life. But it is as it is, and I am now grateful, very grateful, to be in a position to try to do something to ensure that kids get a better deal.
And hey, working in education is not a bad place to be thriving anyway, is it?
Yeah, and I mean, just on that, just to end on a kind of a positive note, because I guess you did ask us about, what aspects of our education did we thrive in, and I think, but between the bits which perhaps felt frustrating, certainly, I don't want to speak for Valerie, but for me, it was those moments of kind of really connecting with teachers and realizing, here's a full real person who really cares about things sort of beyond what's on this syllabus. And little bits of that would sneak in the edges. And those kind of glimpses, I think, were always the bits that were most exciting. So yeah, I think that's always that first spark of kind of what thriving meant for me, was seeing, you can really kind of care about some stuff out there. And that was always exciting.
I like that phrase, full real person. I think we're going to return to that actually in what one of our school leaders says later on in the podcast. Well, thank you. That's a really interesting introduction. And I think that brings us nicely into the book that you've written together. So let's talk about the book. Your new book, Thrive, The Purpose of Schools in a Changing World, was published during the COVID-19 pandemic, and you make reference to it. But you began thinking about it and writing the text before 2020, and indeed published a first edition, I think in 2017, I think I'm right in saying.
That's right.
So I'm wondering if you could firstly give us a flavour for the listeners as to what they should expect if they read Thrive, and secondly, tell us what motivated you to write the book in the first place.
Well, I'll kick off this time and start with your second question, Paul, about the motivation, because at that stage in my career, I had been working in the field of innovation in education in a number of spaces. There was a really interesting opportunity to work within an innovation unit in the ministry here under Estelle Morris's leadership. Subsequently, we launched and made successful a not-for-profit organisation called Innovation Unit, which is still going strong. And so one was working in a space of a curiously frustrating set of circumstances where teachers and head teachers were really keen to change the framework of learning, and particularly critical of the kind of assessment apparatus that they seem to have to force their young people to fit in with, but yet experienced a system which seemed to hold everything in place. And so there were lots of really interesting examples within institutions of change and experimentation and shift towards a more relevant, a more inspiring, a more engaging education for young people. But there was no sign of that happening at the system level. And so my motivation, I must let Amelia speak for herself, but my motivation was particularly around the conundrum of how to get system change. And I became convinced that part of the problem was the overpowering, the overwhelming narrative, the predominant narrative around education, what it's for, which is, in my view, mostly tacit, unexplicated, and all the more powerful for that. And it is a narrative which defines success, again, in somewhat narrow, highly academic ways, but which sees education fundamentally in economistic terms, that defines success as improvements in GDP at the national level, and also for the individual, a chance to earn more money and get better jobs. And when you start to sort of lay it out and listen really carefully to what politicians say about education, that's the narrative they still give, and it's what parents kind of almost imbibe, or by osmosis. It's the assumption. Although, of course, if you ask any parent what they want for their child, they always come up with the first answer: I want her to be happy. But yet, that is not remotely configured within the education system as a whole. So, in short, I believe that part of the problem was the national narrative, the international narrative about what learning was for. And the more I thought about this, the more I felt that the conditions of the 21st century, and this is pre-COVID, were that we were entering the age of disruption and hyperchange. And that we were, as a species, entering a period such that we had never encountered speed and depth and penetration of change in this kind of way before. And at the beginning of the workbook, I set out 3 areas of change which are around what's happening on our planet and our environment. Since we wrote the book, of course, my God, has that come to the fore. Secondly, the way in which technology has reached this kind of apotheosis and is proceeding at an almost incomprehensible rate. And thirdly, changes to human beings themselves, not unrelated to the way in which technology is changing who we are and how we will become. So all of that change meant that the old narrative, the expectations about what learning was for, were completely out of date. So that was my inspiration and my motivation. And I set off to kind of write a critique of that and to offer a new narrative, which was about thriving. And if you start to talk the language of thriving, you are thrown into redefining what we really mean by that in the conditions of this new century. Well, it's not all that new anymore, but in this new hyper-changing space. So maybe I'll let Amelia say something about her motivation too.
Yeah, so then I came in really to have, we then wanted kind of alternating chapters where we could bring in, what can this look like in schools? So for schools that are already recognizing how much things are changing around them, have already been rethinking their purpose, we wanted to kind of show a little bit of what that looked like. So then we have these pathfinder chapters, which are describing a little bit of what it looks and feels like in those schools, and how they have kind of been on their own journeys to move in that direction. And the motivation for those was really, I've been very fortunate to have this experience with Valerie and others as part of the Global Education Leaders Partnership, of traveling to a number of different countries, of working with educators and system leaders in different countries, and seeing many different kinds of schools, and particularly sort of schools that were really at the forefront of kind of rethinking what they were for. And it was always just this incredible experience of the assumptions of what schooling are about being shaken. And in particular, at one point, I was on a kind of study visit with a group of teachers from the UK, well, from England, in British Columbia in Canada. And I think we're going to hear a bit from some educators from BC, and people will get a flavour of some of the things that are very different there in terms of educational philosophy. And just watching teachers from England kind of talk to and observe and learn about some of the different assumptions in the BC system. I think really reveal kind of how powerful it can be to see living, breathing examples of what school can be like. So that was a bit of what we wanted to share in those Pathfinder chapters.
Great, thank you. The word thrive is obviously such a key word for the book. It's part of the title. The word thrive is such a succinct word in so many ways. And I think as people read the book, they're going to find out just how many different things the word thrive can in fact mean. I was wondering if you would like to expand just a little bit more on why you chose that word and why you've seen how even more that's so pertinent when you have discussed the book with other people or indeed presented on the topic around the world. Yeah,
I selected it because I hoped that it would indicate something which was more holistic than the concepts of success. I'm clear, we both were clear that we needed to shake up what people's definition of succeeding was, and to think about a whole life really, rather than the sort of narrow channels which education conventionally is concerned with. Surely our time in our schools ought to be really a much more, holistic and engaging experience for the whole human. And so the term thrive, sort of a biological metaphor really, was chosen, we hope, to connote this notion of becoming everything that one might become in one's environment. Now, clearly, if you think about humans, not all will thrive. Some will tragically get terrible illnesses or have their growth stunted or their developments curtailed by all kinds of circumstances. But still it felt important to reach out to a notion which was almost of a plant or a biological entity becoming all it might be, even in the face of the knowledge that in the end we all die. I don't want to get too metaphysical about this, but it is the case. So how can we thrive and become all that we might be in the fullest sense of that? And it was a helpful pointer because in so doing, that drove me to think about the very different dimensions of thriving and the way in which they are related. So hence, we started to think about there being 4 levels of thriving, interdependently connected, and sort of stranding out then what attending to thriving at that level might look like.
And just one thing I'll add about, I think the biological sort of nature of the metaphor is so important because it really shifts us away from thinking about success as something kind of defined by standards or by a sort of idea of competition where anything that then deviates from that is kind of less than. Because in a way, then any sort of difference, any diversity is inevitably either kind of less than or more than. Whereas thriving, in biological systems, in ecosystems, they're full of diversity, and diversity is what makes them thrive. So I think that was a really kind of key shift that we wanted to indicate.
It reminds me actually of a blog I once saw that a headmaster of a school had written where he spoke about a rainforest of being in schools and how everything's so interconnected. Things, exactly, and so things live off each other essentially, and so that it's the interdependencies you've already described there. Thank you. We'll come back to each of the strands just in a minute, but just very briefly, if I may, before we do so, I mentioned about how you wrote a first edition of the book and then the second edition has now come out 3-4 years later. And we've had the pandemic in between and as we record, still ongoing as well. So I was wondering, just in brief, as I say, what would you say has changed both positively and less so since the first edition of the book was published?
I mean, I think positively, a conversation has opened up in the sense that everybody who has been looking after children at home, educating them at home, teachers who have had to very rapidly adapt to different circumstances, particularly in those first few months of the pandemic, everybody's kind of forced to step back and say, okay, well, what are we really trying to do here? What are the most important things? I think the kind of unfortunate downside of that is sometimes just the pressure to keep the show on the road in such difficult circumstances has meant that sometimes we've reached for the pieces that are that keep some sense of sort of control and keep some sense of order about what we're doing. And so I think there is still a lot of untapped opportunity perhaps coming out of the pandemic to really rethink some of the kind of structures of schooling in terms of things like how we're using time, how are we dividing things up, what kind of lengths of time are we giving young people to think about things. So there's still some of that I think that is untapped, but certainly just that opportunity to try out different things, which was required as we were dealing with those early stages. Is one that I hope things will still come out of it in the years to come.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, clearly it's two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, or Janus mask almost, leaders of schools feel compelled somehow to, quote, get back to normal and to replace that which was lost because people did miss school so badly. And all the talk about learning loss and lowered standards, and particularly in terms, I think, of what's happened with examinations and assessment, about which perhaps Amelia will speak more later. So all of that is a kind of pressure to snap back to what was there before. Whereas, paradoxically, of course, people have also been forced to think much more seriously and radically about the things that really matter. And the epidemic of depression and anxiety and sheer misery that beset many young people as they were locked up for months on end, particularly kids who were in more disadvantaged backgrounds who did not have access to great technology or only shared access to quite poor quality technology and very little opportunity to get outside their bedrooms virtually, has led to a focus and a realization of the importance of emotional thriving, and also the social dimension to that. So it's no easy task, I think, for leaders of schools and classroom teachers to be looking both ways at those sort of conflicting pressures and indeed opportunities. We hope they will, and we hope that the book will give people some keys and some clues about what direction to travel in to address them.
That's it. And he mentions there about some people talk a lot about learning loss. Of course, there have been, in a sense, learning gains for some people too. There's one of our other collaborators, whom I know that you know, Valerie, you've met, Professor Amanda Kirby, who talked quite extensively at the beginning of the pandemic about those who might otherwise not be included normally. Suddenly, working online, they were much more included and they could be who they wanted to be rather than being forced to fit into a particular paradigm of schooling as it had been up until that point.
Absolutely, Paul. And in the new edition, one of the additions to it is a chapter on agency. And we were very keen to include that because we feel that, one of the keys to thriving is a growing sense of personal agency amongst young people. And in the pandemic, what we saw was the opportunity for greater agency to be exerted, depending on the kind of frameworks that teachers created. But in some circumstances, learners were much more capable and enabled to manage their own time, to choose foci for more depth work and research. For some young people, it suited them absolutely down to the ground, and they do not want to go back to a regularized 9 to 3, move on the bell, have 40 minutes, drip feed on this or that subject. So, as you say, there were opportunities seized by some, but by no means by all.
Thank you. So in this context, I think it's a good point then to move on to the essence of the book. And we've spoken already about the strands. So just to mention those again to those who are tuning in, these strands are about proposing what we need to understand for our current and future worlds. And they are planetary and global, societal, interpersonal and intra-personal. So we're going to take each of these in turn. And as I mentioned at the beginning as well, we have some guests joining us from schools in the UK and Canada to tell us about what they've done, either actually as a result of what they've read in the book, which is fantastic, or indeed the ways that you've described what they do in the book already. So it's quite interesting to hear from them, because then we can get more of a feel for how this works in practice as well. So I'm going to start, first of all, the wider scope here, perhaps focusing on the planetary and global strands. So I was wondering, Amelia, if you could please describe for us briefly what this strand concerns.
Yeah, sure. So there's sort of two aspects to it, one of which is about planetary thriving in the sense of the health, so the sustainability of our planet and its ecosystems, and their abilities to sustain life. So the climate emergency, but also ecosystem loss, biodiversity loss. And the other is about kind of globalization and people's ability to operate, to live, to work, to relate in an increasingly kind of globally interconnected world. So we look at both of those in terms of kind of what's happening, just setting out some of the evidence about what's happening. And then we look at schools who are sort of taking those issues seriously in the way that they construct their curriculum and think about how they use time.
Wonderful. And it's something which is much in the news, of course, so probably a lot of our listeners are familiar with some of these issues, but they may not necessarily have had the time, the opportunity yet to do as much with them as they would like to. But let's have a listen to Andy Moore, who's CEO of Holy Family Catholic Multi-Academy Trust based in the Wirral, not far from Liverpool, or is Liverpool in the Wirral? I'm never quite sure. They're next to each other anyway, in the northwest of England. And he's going to tell us a bit about what is happening in his schools.
Hi, my name's Andy Moore. I'm Chief Executive Officer of Holy Family Catholic Multi-Academy Trust in the northwest of England, which has 5 schools across the region, 2 secondaries and 3 primaries. So we are encouraging our young people to look after the planet by really putting it at the heart of what we do. We have a responsibility in schools, don't we, to deliver the curriculum. So we place these issues, particularly around conservation, that we have done across our schools, appropriately within the curriculum. We teach the national curriculum. It's important to teach the knowledge and understanding that the children need as the system demands, but actually we want them to use this information to take then an objective view and describe and face the issues that the planet is facing right now, because facts are facts. We are in a really, really significant point in time in terms of the precipice of the 6th mass extinction. So the facts are facts. We want the children to understand and do something about this. And, that has really made a difference for our kids, because it's been it's been information that really matters to them. So it's really moved them from engagement to investment and then to taking action. So that's the other thing we want. We want our young people to have a sense of agency, feeling that they're able to do something about the situation the planet faces. And we design that into our school and curriculum design. I mean, we believe education's purpose, as the book makes really, really clear, about thriving at all levels, and that's as individuals, society, and the planet. And that really chimes with our faith as well. So as a Catholic school, Pope Francis wrote a papal encyclical, Laudato Si, and talked about care for creation, us being stewards for the earth. And that's what we put at the heart of our curriculum. We work locally with Chester Zoo, which sits within the footprint of one of our primary schools, St. Bernard's, and that's been an amazing journey. And we've worked with them as local partners to visit the zoo, but also getting involved in their international work. So we started developing our curriculum about the plight of Indonesian songbirds, and that led to some incredible work where we built that across the curriculum. But our young people designed a whole range of activities around the curriculum and with our teachers, for artwork, to drama, to dance. And we put on a massive big exhibition for the local community to raise those issues and raise the awareness. And that lit a fire in our children, lit a fire in our staff, and gave us the opportunity to think about what education was really for. Do we work for that next inspection, the next test, the next election? Now, we all know that we work for that next generation, and that's something that now we place at the heart of our curriculum. We then went on to work with partners across the local area. We worked with over 80 schools to help them design their curriculum and put conservation issues at the heart of that. And that's been really, really significant. And we've all reflected on how, as an individual school organisation, we help our young people to develop that secure sense of self, that intrapersonal, and working in relationships with those around them. But most importantly, how can we, as individuals within individual schools in the northwest of England, make that impact on society and the globe around them? And with Chester Zoo, we've really found that that's been possible. So, by the end of our work here, we've worked with over 80 schools to develop that knowledge-rich, which is really important for our system at the moment, but humanity-rich curriculum, and give our young people the knowledge, the skills, the understanding to succeed within our system, to be coming out with the academic outcomes that we want them to, but actually to be coming out with so much more to make a difference in our world, and I think there's a quote that I like that captures this really, that says that, there's power in knowledge that is there, but ultimately it's our humanity which will turn that knowledge into wisdom. And that's what we aim to do with our curriculum. And our young people have carried that forward. And one of our 9-year-old girls, who was an absolute star with our work around the songbirds, said this in one of our projects. She said, people may underestimate us just because we're children and think we can't change anything. But we've proved that actually anyone can do anything they want. And she believes she can change the world. And we believe our young people can change the world by learning about this in our schools and actually taking action. And, we believe at the moment, with the work that we've done, we've built over 22,000 young conservationists within our schools. And we aim to take that further with our transition work, with our secondaries, and working with the wider community over the next few years. So yeah, really, really powerful. I believe this is something that is integral to our schools and integral to the survival of our planet.
Okay, so Andy talked very clearly about two things there: working for the next generation and giving children self-belief that they can change the world. Now, we often hear about climate change. So what would you say is exemplary about what Andy is doing in his schools? And are there any other similar examples or indeed different examples that you've seen elsewhere around the world? Valerie, I don't know whether you'd like to start us off with that one.
Well, I'll start off, but Amelia might like to comment on other exemplars. I think Andy has done terrific work in certain... Well, let me say, by the way, when the book came out, to suggest that the notion of planetary and global thriving should be a key focus and that a key lens was not nearly as acceptable a proposition as it now is. I mean, I remember very clearly when I was doing the early stages of the book, going to audiences and talking about this, and the kind of look in people's eyes was, seriously? Yeah, we can do a bit of it here, a bit on science curriculum, a bit in geography perhaps, but the idea that it should provide a frame and a lens for a very central focus of learning was not taken seriously. And Andy was one of the few visionaries who saw that it needs to be and can be, and that actually there is no... Well, as another great exemplar of this work, Gwyn ap Harry, who runs the XP school in Doncaster and a group of other schools coming online, which is an exemplar of expeditionary learning, puts it this way: I do not believe there is any aspect of the national curriculum in science or anything else that cannot be taught through this lens. You can do it through this lens, but in so doing, you will make it relevant, you will make it alive, you will put it in the space where kids really, really care about this stuff, because they do, and they can see it not just at the sort of global, rather abstract level, but in their own lives and in their own communities. So Andy is one of the literally pathfinders, to use the term we adopted for the book, who saw that even within the constraints of English assessment, English national curriculum, it was possible to do this work in a really serious way and engage young learners really powerfully in it. I don't know if you want to mention any other examples, Amelia.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the really exciting things happening here are around kind of rethinking of curriculum and assessment to get what Andy described there as sort of knowledge-rich and humanity-rich educational experiences. So, this is a subject which is full of knowledge. It's complex in many ways. There's a lot for young people to learn, and so it should be, right at the center of what we're doing in schools. So there are organisations like Students Organising for Sustainability, SOS UK, who are among the organisations campaigning for some curriculum change on this, because although, as Andy described, one can, at least in the English system, sort of do this alongside the national curriculum. And certainly in other countries as well, we see how, curricula at a state or a national level are being adapted to bring in a bit more sort of content around the climate emergency. There's still, I think, a long way to go to really think through, what does it look like to support young people to learn about this in ways that are general, that are global, but also ways that are very sort of place-based, as Andy was describing about the partnerships. So I think some of those efforts to kind of organize at the kind of multi-school level are really exciting, because they'll result hopefully in tools that teachers, that others can start to bring in and make it a little bit easier for more people to do this.
And it's great that there is an example which is, so sort of homegrown. I mean, we're not talking about something exotic, but if you want to look at the exotic, then a school I've had a much closer look at is the Green School in Bali. It's not just one school now; it's as a kind of chain, as a network of schools. There's one in Mexico, one in New Zealand now as well, near Auckland. And these are schools, it does what it says on the tin, focusing really fundamentally and profoundly on the issue of environmental thriving. So your listeners might like simply to Google the Green School, and they will get some very inspiring practice.
Thank you, and we'll make a mention of that in the show notes as well, so that those listening can have a look at that if they want to directly. Thank you. I mean, we could talk a lot more about each of these strands. Of course, we only have limited time in the podcast. So we're going to move on to the next strands now, and we can provide the connections between them as well, because as you say, each of these strands are interdependent. They're not exclusive from each other. So the next strand is the societal strands in the book. And here you describe the importance of being able to navigate what you determine as a disrupted and uncertain landscape of work, and also about the reinvention of democracy. Now, some might say the world has always been in a state of evolution uncertainty with regard to both work and democracy. So why have you called out these two areas in the book?
Well, I'll kick off on that one. In trying to clearly, unless our environment and our globe thrives, then we've had it. We're toast. That goes without saying. But people live within communities and societies, and notwithstanding what I said at the top of this podcast about the goals of education in the past being about greater productivity and prosperity and wealth and better jobs and so forth, I'm not anti-prosperity. I think it's a pretty good thing, really. But I am in favour of green growth. I am a critic of extractive growth and of GDP as being a kind of symbol or major signifier of successful societies. So the question became, if we live at this community, societal level, what does thriving look like in that context? How would you define it? And our problem in so doing was to avoid anything which is overtly kind of ideological. People have different views, really, about what a thriving society might be, very plainly. So where to go in that? Well, the first place to go was around the importance of meaningful and dignified work in human lives, and therefore the responsibility of schools to enable young people to find such work which granted them the possibility of a decent standard of living, of growing families, of having decent housing, to thrive economically, whilst not necessarily becoming disgustingly rich, seems an important prerequisite for a thriving life. But when you examine the landscape of work, it is a profoundly uncertain, fast-changing and disrupting landscape, in one in which it's very, very difficult to make safe bets. And what we found was that schools across the world are really interested in enabling young people to focus on the world of work, not with a kind of determination about a single career path, but rather with a level of flexibility and inquiry and a sense of growth, if you like, about where they might make their contribution, and be prepared to change that over a lifetime. Hence, we suggested that the best thing that schools can do in this front is to enable young people to navigate that transforming landscape of work with some degrees of confidence in their own capability to learn and relearn and change perhaps even their fields of endeavour and their field of expertise. So that was one. And if I just do the last bit very quickly, I'm sure Amelia will want to add a bit to this. in defining what is a thriving society, we were very influenced by a piece of work by two sociologists called Wilkinson and Pickett, who wrote a very influential book called The Spirit Level. And in that, they asked the question, what is a thriving society? And counterintuitively pointed to the fact that if you aggregate all the indicators of thriving, which are kind of unarguable, like levels of suicide, levels of unemployment, levels of homelessness, postnatal mortality, levels of incarceration, markers that were really, you could not argue were indicators of a thriving society or the reverse. If you aggregate those, you found that the most thriving societies were actually not the richest. They were the ones who distributed whatever resources they had most equitably, which is an enormously interesting finding. Because if you're saying that equitable distribution of resources is a precursor to more thriving societies on the whole against all those indicators, then the question becomes, well, how do you get more equitable societies? Now, here you do, as it were, risk moving into the ideological. But to get more equity, we propose democracy is the best route that we so far have managed to design imperfectly, very imperfectly. And we point out in the book how, for many people, democracy has been a disappointment. Indeed, young people have turned away from democracy, and we feel that the results of doing that are extremely dangerous. So our proposal in the book is that actually, for moving in the direction of more equitable societies, young people need to be enabled to really engage with recreating and redesigning democracy for all, which sounds highfalutin and kind of grandiose, and we're unashamed of that because we think that actually learning for a new form of democracy is one of the most important things that education systems ought to be doing right now. And everything since 2016, when democracy took an absolute hammering, has made that all the more important.
I think, the only thing I'll add there is just this is the focus on democracy builds very much on the idea of agency that Valerie was mentioning earlier, and the fact that thriving is sort of ultimately about agency, and the way that we exercise agency collectively is through democracy. There's a very long tradition of schools being kind of sites of where young people learn democratic processes, learn how to engage with each other. And so they can hopefully also be sites where collectively as societies, we can kind of reinvent some of those processes. We can learn different approaches, different ways of thinking about how we can work together collectively. So that's part of how that ended up being a key focus there.
Thank you. And indeed, that word agency is one that I was going to pick up on, because Andy did mention that. And indeed, our next speaker, whom we're going to hear from in a moment, she speaks in terms of agency as well. So it's a word that we keep coming back to. Know that lots of teachers talk in terms of agency for themselves as well, so how they can also enact things for their students. So let's have a listen to what Brooke Moore has to say. She's at a school in Canada, and there at that school there's a focus on teaching students how to make decisions so they can participate more meaningfully and authentically, that word again, we've used that before in the podcast today, in democracy. So let's hear what she has to say about the work they're doing in her school.
Yeah, my name is Brooke Moore, and I'm currently the district principal of Inquiry and Innovation in the Delta School District, which is on the lands of the Musqueam peoples and Tsawwassen First Nation, and it's on the west coast of Canada. Part of the process around, or the approach to the ideas around authentic and meaningful democracy is around what kind of thinking do we need to do in order to participate authentically. The Delta School District, over a decade ago, went through a visioning process, and we came up with a vision that really centered on ideas of success for individuals and for communities. And now we're going through a revisioning process, and it's coming up very, very clearly around the purpose of our vision is for ideas like, more like in the book Thrive, like around flourishing and around what does it look like when an individual thrives? What does it look like when a community thrives? What do we need to do, and what questions should we be asking in order to get there? So a big part of that has been decision making. teaching kids how to make decisions. And there's a lot of opportunity for that in our curriculum, because our curriculum really focuses on competencies like communication and collaboration, critical thinking, creative thinking, things like that. So what that looks like here in Delta, and increasingly so in a lot of districts around Canada, is that we're really focusing on helping individual students learn who they are and who they want to be in the world. And when you do that kind of thinking, you really have to think about what's important to you. And that's one of the main processes of this decision framework that we've been using, is in any sort of situation where you have to make a decision, we think about, well, what matters in this context, what matters most. And in the creative thinking comes in, what possible ways could we go about satisfying what matters, addressing what matters, and then coming up with an action that follows from those values. And that's a huge part of the authentic part, because when we act based on someone else's values or on what we've been told to do, then that lacks authenticity. So when we ask, how do we allow young people or create opportunities for young people to participate authentically, that means they must know themselves and what matters in a situation, and know what matters to others in the situation, so that then they can make a decision and take action in an authentic and meaningful way. This looks like a lot of different things. It can look like a small project, it can look like a really big project. We had a group of intermediate students figuring out, the question, what can I do to make a positive impact to somebody or something in my community? And over COVID, they were thinking about this question, and it was a longer term project. It took a few months. They researched agencies such as food banks and animal shelters, and came up with a lot of really beautiful ideas around how they could positively impact somebody. Some students came up with ways to connect with senior citizens who were really isolated at that time during COVID, and helping them connect with the rest of the community. Some kids figured out how to raise money for the food bank. And they did all of that by using a really clear, scaffolded approach to teaching decision making. So that's a big part of the democracy question there, because when we're thinking about democracy, that means agency. We all have agency. And to use that agency, to use our ideas and our power and our thinking and our skills in a powerful, positive way, it needs to connect to what really matters. And what we found is that for most kids, what really, really matters is the health of the environment, the health of our citizens, moving forward in a way that will make it possible for people to thrive in a functioning, democratic kind of citizenry. There's another example. Something had happened at the school, and there's a few students who thought, that sounds like racism's been involved, and we're not going to stand for that. So they, with the vice principal, Joanna McIntosh at Sand Secondary, they got really curious about, well, what is racism? What is going on in our schools that is racist? What is anti-racism? Let's think more about that. And they used an inquiry process, which is essentially a series of decisions around, how are we going to think about this? What is the situation? What really matters here? And how can we make a positive difference? And so in that way, they've made a large impact on the district as well as their school, because they've been engaging as a group collectively, thinking through what really matters, and then making sure that their decisions and their actions reflect those values. So those are some really concrete ways that the ideas that you're talking about have found space in our school system to grow. A big part of addressing the ideas in your question is really about helping learners learn how to hear one another's perspectives and listen in a way that builds more generative space. So much of what we see right now is a very polarized conversation. What we've seen happen with students when they come into a classroom, Joanne Calder's classroom, for example, 12-year-olds came into the classroom feeling really divided on an issue that had occurred in our community. And using the decision maker moves requires that you listen to one another's perspectives in order to identify what really matters to everybody so that you can figure out a way of enacting your agency in a way that everyone can get behind and that harms nobody. So by the end of the time of using the decision maker moves and thinking about, well, what should have happened, or what do you think would have been the right decision with this community event? What had looked like a very polarized class at the beginning became a much more understanding group of kids, and about 50% of them actually changed their position and changed their mind because they had listened and engaged with one another's ideas and thinking more deeply about what really matters, rather than coming from a really responsive place and only having those sound bites that we in the adult world tend to base a lot of our conversations and our opinions on. So I think these slow thinking kind of frameworks, like in British Columbia, we use the spirals of inquiry, and increasingly more and more schools are using these decision maker moves. These slow thinking processes allow us to engage with each other as more compassionate human beings. And I think that is so important because these polarized conversations often come from a really fast thinking kind of place. So more and more, we're seeing more and more success in our school system when the adults in the system and when the kids in the system can use a framework that slows their thinking down so that they can engage from a good place and make better decisions to enact their agency.
Well, Brooke mentions there that during the pandemic, students in her school have helped senior citizens and worked with food banks as an example. To what extent do you think that our experience of COVID-19, the pandemic, has underlined the importance of looking after each other, but doing so with greater understanding and compassion?
I do think that one of the things it has created is a sort of return to focus on communities. So much of our lives, particularly for those of us living in cities, had, I think, previously become one of commuting and often working at great distances, and sort of being forced in a way to really refocus on the things around us opens up different kinds of opportunities for how you impact people, for how you work together with people. And I think this is something, as we heard from Brooke, that schools have found as well. So I think that it's very connected again to this idea of sort of being place-based, that there is something that comes through really getting to know the people and the opportunities and also the problems that are directly around you. That then those are also the things you can perhaps kind of have the most impact on. And so that idea of agency is ultimately about sort of, what can you do, what can you affect in the world, and democracy can exist at that very, very local level, as well as more broadly.
But your point about COVID, Paul, does take us into the other emergent insight, I think, and the third level of thriving, which is at the interpersonal level. And it was apparent across the world. Young people were saying it anywhere they got the opportunity, that what they missed was the social connections, the interpersonal friendships, the society of others, not just of their peers, but of their teachers too. They missed actually relating to them one-to-one. And when we were all locked up in that way, we relied on Zoom, and goodness knows what we would have done without the technologies to support us. But that sense of being in relationship with other individuals was so fundamental to who we are as the human animal, that it does take us very firmly into that third level of thriving that we describe or propose in the book, which is at the interpersonal level. And what we're trying to do here is suggest that it is a site for learning, that it is not just a matter. If you are asking how young people can be enabled to make and keep and sustain really strong relationships, then we don't think that that's just a matter of chance or, good genetic structure or your family background. We think it's a learnable thing. You can be reflective about it. And therefore, we propose that when we talk curriculum, our curriculum, and I don't mean the hidden curriculum or the implicit, I mean the explicit curriculum, site of learning, intentional learning, should be around relationships. And if I were to be even more topical about that in the UK context, where belatedly, following the launch of the Everyone's Invited website, people starting to wake up to how in many schools there remains a culture, if not of outright misogyny, of sexism, which has led to a disfiguring of relationships between sexes, in terms of young people understanding who they are and how they relate to others. So that's why we suggest within the book that a learning goal, an explicit learning goal, ought to be around learning how to create respectful, loving relationships in a technologized society. Technologized because for many people, increasingly, their relationships are mediated by screens. And we ask the question as to whether, in such a context, one of the casualties is empathy. And of course, empathy is an absolute prerequisite for great relationships. It's an arguable point. There are alternative perspectives, fully accept that. But we think it's an issue, put it mildly, not least when the very youngest kids in our societies actually have access to pornography of the most damaging and dangerous forms, and the kind of disfiguring impact that has on the creation of powerful, what we call loving and respectful relationships. So, in a nutshell, all of that led us to suggesting that the space of creating learning experiences, learning programs around creating great relationships is for us an important focus, and it's become even more so since COVID.
Thank you. So let's indeed move on to the third strand, which again is about engaging with and learning with others. And you talk there particularly about empathy, about respecting other people, respecting other generations, as well as the place of technology in our lives. And as you described there, throughout the pandemic, technology has been both a blessing and in some ways a curse for us. It's enabled us to make contact with other people, but it's also meant that we speak to each other through screens. And the natural fact, the first time you meet people after you've been on technology with them, it's a little bit strange, actually. It feels very odd. It's hard to remember what it's like to be in the same room as somebody else sometimes. So we asked Rae Snape, who's head teacher at Milton Road Primary School in Cambridge, to tell us about the curriculum she introduced that was actually inspired by Thrive, your book. And I was really impressed by the ways in which her school uses resources that are on their doorstep. So let's listen to what she said.
I'm Rae Snape. I'm the head teacher of Milton Road Primary School in Cambridge, and I'm a national leader of education. Our curriculum at Milton Road Primary School has been very much inspired by the domains that are mentioned in the original Thrive book: the personal, the interpersonal, the societal, and the global. And we've used that to set our curriculum and to conceive of our curriculum against 4 compass points. So the South is about identity and being able to connect with yourself and your understanding of your place in the world. On the East is the idea of creativity and connection. On the West is wisdom. It's where knowledge, cultural capital sits. And then in the North is a piece about being a change maker, the idea that children have voice, choice, and agency to have a positive impact on themselves, their own lives, and on society. And those 4 principles are really underpinned by the personal, the interpersonal, the societal, and global. And importantly, our curriculum is place-based. So we're thinking about what the children can learn from the people, places, objects, and stories that are in Cambridge, so that once they've had an understanding of the richness, the social and historical culture that's within our city, they can use that to then think about a springboard for what they can bring and offer to making a positive change. And so the curriculum has a strong historical focus, history and geography focus. And we had a teacher who did a huge amount of research. So I'd say she's a teacher researcher. And she met lots of different people to hear about the history of Cambridge and to research some of the resources and museums and other facets of Cambridge, so that it brings a sense of place and purpose to the curriculum for the children. And we're just starting this to roll out what we're calling our Cambridge Connected curriculum, with the hope that children will then also be working with older people within the local community to find out about the stories that I hear, and a project to work intergenerationally with a care home that's on the corner of the road where the school is, and to make some really positive connections to find out more about the place where the school is set, and also to understand about what the children can do to bring positivity and richness to the school community and make a positive impact on the future.
Rae School is focusing on geography, history and interactions with older people. So I was wondering, to what extent from your research you think this will help or ground pupils in the face of a society that is increasingly driven by technology? Amelia, do you go first?
I think this was one of the really exciting aspects of the book for me, because it wasn't something I had learned that much about before, heard that much about before, of this kind of a focus on intergenerational relationships within schools, and schools that are partnering with old people's homes, essentially, to create new kinds of learning opportunities, new kinds of learning relationships. And I think as a way to model relationships, and also as a way to kind of foster a very different kind of relationship for young people, I think it's such a powerful example, and one that we were excited to see also being kind of replicated, and it's been experimented with in other parts of the world. So I think on the one hand, obviously, in general, the older generation tends to rely less on technology, and therefore it's an opportunity for young people to kind of engage with people in a different way. On the other hand, I think just whether it's in person or whether it is through technology, I think those kind of intergenerational relationships can be such a fantastic sort of source of knowledge, of values, of different ways of thinking about what people care about. That it's just a fantastic additional perspective for young people to have access to.
Thank you. Now, your fourth and final strand focuses on the importance of looking after ourselves. So you write about the need for us to have what you describe as a secure sense of self, which I think is a great phrase, a secure sense of self. And you suggest we should take greater responsibility for our own personal health, fitness, and well-being. Now, younger generations are often accused of being self-centered or lacking responsibility. So how can we encourage and teach children and adolescents to take greater care of themselves in a more reflective way? Valerie, what do you think?
Yeah, and one I might add, in the age of Instagram and other disfiguring and depleting developments, which encourage a form of focus on the self, which is not growthful, which is not conducive towards thriving, and all the data coming out now about what the companies themselves know to be the damaging effect of these websites and apps is really dispiriting. But I guess our take on this was, in the first, let's take the body first of all. Let's start with the physical dimension. It is just astounding to me that young people can come out of school and still not really understand how to keep their body in good nick. We have an epidemic. I just use that word lightly and perhaps too easily, but it does count as that, of obesity amongst young people. And what we're seeing is a growth of the chronic diseases of high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes, everything that obesity brings. And if you look at the data, it is truly frightening. We all know the drivers for it. But young people in school have the opportunity to, as it were, make their own body a subject of study, a subject of inquiry, because increasingly what we're understanding is that we are all really, really unique. And in the time in school, given that we haven't been handed a handbook as to how to look after yourself, we almost need to write our own handbook. And I think if you flip it and imagine young people inquiring into what makes a great diet for them, things that they both really enjoy and is really good for their own microbiome and for their own levels of metabolism and energy, what makes a great exercise regime for them, what form of exercise, when it might not be team sport, it might or it might not, it might be something quite different. What forms of exercise really excite them and please them and keep their body in the shape that it was meant to be in order to thrive. So all of that space for learning is one, I think, which needs to be much more personalised and unequivocally put at the centre of learning programmes, not apologetically or on the side. So that was one dimension. But the second is where you started, Paul, which is the psychological, the mental and emotional strands of intra-personal thriving. And we know again that levels of anxiety, levels of depression, suicide levels actually, particularly since COVID, have become appallingly high. So what is it that schools should be doing? Not, in our view, downstream, providing counsellors and emergency services, but working upstream to give young people the tools and the techniques by which they can learn how to understand their emotions, find a sense of personal purpose and meaning in what they do. Develop that sense of who they are, that sense of self, not in a narcissistic and self-absorbed way, but as a way of enabling them to contribute to the thriving at the other three levels. We put it last in the book. People have said, when I've discussed the book with them at various meetings, you should have put it first. Because if you don't have that, you can't contribute to the other levels of thriving that you talk about in the book. We would say, well, they're also profoundly interconnected. It's a circle. Where do you start? But we do see that there are two aspects of it: the physical, the emotional, and the psychological. And of course, those two themselves are related very powerfully. And what we wanted to do, and this is where Amelia's research was completely critical, was to explore areas, examples of schools who had put it into their curriculum, who did take it seriously, who saw it as an important learning goal, and were doing so very successfully.
Thank you. Well, what you've been describing there fits very nicely with our next clip from somebody who works in Canada again. This is Kim Ondrik, who works at Mill Bay Nature School in the province of British Columbia. So let's listen to what she says is happening in her school with regard to giving students responsibility and also looking after themselves and their own selves mentally as well as physically.
So my name is Kim Ondrik. I'm the head learner, otherwise known as the principal of Quishintolalem Mill Bay Nature School on Vancouver Island in the province of British Columbia in Canada. So our school began, this is our fourth year of enactment, and when it began, we worked in partnership with local Halkominum speaking elders. So those are the Indigenous people that have lived on this land for 10,000 years, long before settlers arrived. And those elders encouraged us from the very beginning to focus on building community. And although we didn't know exactly what that meant in the setting of a school, and wanted to move beyond just the idea of community or something that you take up for, the beginnings of school and then you leave behind as school gets rolling, as rhythms get rolling. Instead, our elder Tusilum said that needed to be the focus for the first year or two of our school. And so that made us look carefully at the BC, the British Columbia curriculum, which is a very generous document that is quite known around the world for its focus on the thriving of children and the movement of learning from deep inside to outside. And that goes from core competencies out to curricular competencies and then out to content. So what would have traditionally been school and content is a lot more than that. So we took a look at the curriculum and decided that we would start our school, and we continue to do so in our fourth year in a much messier way. Deep intention behind it, but in a much messier way than would be traditionally found, even in British Columbia. And children, from the time they're 4 and they enter our school, are invited into experiences that can be confusing, that can be challenging, that can be uncertain. There is a focus on emotional safety. So lots of adults always looking out for children needing support, needing love, needing attention in a variety of ways. But for example, our first day of school is a lot of kids showing up and not necessarily it being super clear and organized what's happening, and instead offering an opportunity for children to make sense of what's going on. We certainly have structures and rhythms in place where we gather. We spend a lot of time outside, and we have outside gathering places that children come to learn that they're parts of groups. But I think what we're seeing here is in terms of larger thriving or well-being, encouraging young people to think deeply, to understand themselves, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. We have structures in place where children can bring their concerns to governance of the school. And so in following the curriculum through that lens, we find here that children are empowered, they have a voice and agency. They feel very attached to the adults that are here, adults that are also willing to take up learning experiences that are not, don't have a firm determination, but instead are very open-ended, that offer many different roads in, many different roads out. Children are even encouraged here, if they feel like they've outgrown learning spaces, that they can call meetings with their parents and their teachers and negotiate what would work better for them. So into CLIM inspiring us to build community, I think what we've seen is a movement away from adults at the school kind of trying to structure things so it feels safe for them and it's familiar for them, and instead being invited into a world that is much more, I think, symmetrical with the real world, where you need to think, you need to understand yourself, you need to figure out the kinds of support that you need in order to find your place in the world. And we experience children that at a young age, 9 or 10, are able to take up very big challenges, are able to problem solve with each other, are able to negotiate with adults. It's very exciting to see. And I can only imagine as our children age, right now our oldest children are 11, but as they get older, that they will just take this up into the more abstract academic world of learning about larger problems that maybe are not things that you directly experience, but maybe experience the downstream effects of. So we're looking forward to the challenge of creating those opportunities as the kids get older.
I was struck there by Kim's use of the word messy and of her school's intention that children learn to navigate a curriculum that is more symmetrical with the real world, so they're better prepared for uncertainty. So I was wondering, in what ways do you think, I'll ask you this, Amelia, in what ways do you think children might be better off getting authentic experiences as opposed to abstract ones in their education. And we mentioned those two words, authentic and abstract, I think at the beginning of our conversation as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great way of putting it, because this is really a key question where there just has to be balance. Of course, a lot of education has to be about engaging with abstract concepts, because that's part of learning. We need those concepts to understand the world. But I think that the emphasis that Kim places on young people being able to, and really quite young children being able to sort of figure out just a little bit more of what it is to be in the world, to solve some more of their own kind of problems on a daily basis, to take some risks, to kind of learn to deal with uncertainty. I think a lot of that is, it is experiential. It sort of has to be experienced as part of learning. And we should say, I think Kim has been in a very supportive system that has enabled her to as she put it, take a kind of a slightly messier approach to developing what a school looks like. And I think the result has been somewhere that is amazing, because, as Valerie put it, this emphasis on kind of personal development, on the emotional and the physical sides of it, has been central. So it's not sort of an instrumental afterthought of, oh gosh, as schools, how do we sort of solve all these wider societal problems like obesity or like mental health crises? It is, exactly as Valerie put it, sort of upstream, in the sense that they're saying, okay, well, how do we help young people really learn how to learn how to live, and what kind of learning environment, what kind of learning designs will support them to learn how to do that.
Thank you. So we're running out of time, unfortunately, on the podcast. So I'm going to ask you one more question, which builds on everything that Kim, Andy, Brooke and Rae have spoken about, and what you've spoken about also with so much passion when you've been talking about your book. And I was wondering how we can encourage others to do things similar to what we've heard about today. How can we almost give people something to do tomorrow? Listeners to this podcast perhaps may be thinking, that sounds great. So what could I do straight away? What can I do in the future as well? But what can I do immediately to make a difference in my school as a result of some of what I've learned from what's in the book Thrive? So Valerie, first of all, perhaps, what do you think some schools could do tomorrow to start to make a difference so their students can thrive?
Well, it's interesting. I'd be absorbed to hear what Amelia says. We might have very different responses to this, but my proposal would be that they start to discuss purpose of learning, purpose of their school, purpose of learning writ large in society as a community. And I just think that is the precursor, really, to make, you can make some little bits of incremental change, copy this bit of practice over here, introduce that bit of change over there. But if you really want to go at this with a degree of seriousness that I believe it requires, then I think that it's not something one can do alone as a teacher. It needs to be a learning community of teachers and the leadership of the school. And I think the starting point is, as learners, to engage with these ideas together, to interrogate them, to express people's own views about what that looks like and feels like, and whether they agree with it, whether they disagree. I mean, I don't think we've got it all right, but I don't think we've got it all wrong either. So engage with the ideas, please. And then when you have come to a view about what thriving in a transforming world might look like for your context, well then, what would that mean in terms of engaging with at least some of those four levels? And I would say pick one and build on something you've got going and see how the thing might spread. And we hope that through the book and through other resources that are now multiply available, you can start, wheels don't have to be reinvented. There's plenty that can be now transferred in, but what must be done from scratch and can't just be copied and pasted is your own commitment to and determination of what thriving looks like in your context, in your community, for your learners. And that requires a conversation given some time. I know that schools, I know only too well, that schools are really, really tight on time at the moment. But for the future, we can't skimp on the personal and professional development of educators. That has to be given time. And every decent system in the world who's really making a shift towards transformation for the 21st century knows that you invest in giving teachers time to do this thinking and do this analysis and plan. So that's what I would suggest.
going to build on Valerie's, and maybe then I'll be allowed one more. Yeah, I mean, I think this question of sort of talking about this in community, the one thing can just be reaching out and connecting with someone, which could be somebody at your school, or it might be somebody, on the other side of the world via a social network, via social media. I think the upside of things like social media is people can connect and learn from and see the work of people who are maybe have different kind of opportunities to think about what education can look like. And people like Brooke and Andy are fantastic examples, I think, of education leaders who have really, used networks, used connections to reach many, many more young people with their work. And so the second one I would say is just to look at the use of time. Valerie spoke about, it's something that is too rarely kind of gifted to educators to really have the time to do this. But I think anyone anywhere can look at how time is being used in their classroom, in their school, and think about where are the pockets of time we could start to have different kind of conversations with young people, with students, with children, because I think everything can flow out of that is hearing more from them about what they care about what they're thinking about, and that's going to lead, I think, to more thriving for them.
Thank you. And I'd thoroughly recommend to listeners to take this book, to use the frameworks within it, to discuss with other teachers, not only within their own school, but in other schools as well, form reading groups, form little communities of supporting each other to understand the different strands, because the book is so well put together. It's very easy then to work your way through. You don't need to take it all in one go, although of course we'll describe the interdependencies, but take it piece by piece, and gradually perhaps you as the listeners here within your schools can work out what you could do next, as described there in your own context, investing appropriate time and for the children of the future as well. So thank you very much to Valerie and to Amelia for talking to us today about their new book. And thank you to everybody for listening as well. If you're interested in purchasing Thrive, The Purpose of Schools in a Changing World, please visit our online or other bookstores, or talk to your local Cambridge University Press and Assessment representative. And that's all for this episode. Don't forget to tell your friends and colleagues about us and rate our show on whatever platform you're listening on. Our show notes have useful links that we've discussed throughout the episode, so be sure to take a look at them. Remember to follow us on CUP Education or use the hashtag BrighterPod to get in touch. And you can also email us if you wish at educationmarketing@cambridge.org. That's educationmarketing@cambridge.org. So thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again for our next podcast. Goodbye.